Tucked away in this misty hollow along the Pennsylvania-Virginia line is a settlement few outsiders ever see. Its people call themselves simply mountain folk. Neighbors, though, have long known.
The buried truth behind the Black Dutch cabins, the mystery tribe of the Appalachian Mountains. I have always believed that DNA tells the truth. That was the foundation of my career, the principle that guided 20 years of work as a genetic genealogist, the faith that kept me searching through databases and samples and family trees long after others would have given up. DNA does not lie. DNA does not forget. DNA preserves the history that families try to hide, the ancestry that shame or fear or simple ignorance has buried beneath generations of silence. I believed this absolutely, until I discovered what was hidden in the hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, until I learned that some families have been lying so long and so well that even their blood has learned to keep secrets. I am writing this now because I have nothing left except the truth, because every institution I trusted has failed me, and because somewhere in those mountains, the people who held me captive are still operating, still erasing identities, still creating new ones, still making people disappear from one life and appear in another, as if the transformation were magic rather than the product of 2 centuries of criminal expertise. My name is Dr. Meredith Vance. I was a genetic genealogist based in Nashville, Tennessee, specializing in complex ancestry cases that other researchers had abandoned as unsolvable. I had built my reputation on cracking the hardest puzzles, tracing family lines through fragmentary records and degraded DNA samples, connecting people to histories they never knew they had. I worked with adoption agencies, law enforcement, historical societies, and private clients who wanted to understand where they came from. I was good at my job. I was respected in my field. I believed that knowledge was always better than ignorance, that the truth about one's ancestry was a gift regardless of what that truth revealed. I was naive in ways I could not have imagined until the fall of 2020, when a client named Harrison Cole walked into my office and asked me to trace his family's Black Dutch heritage. The Black Dutch are one of the enduring mysteries of Appalachian genealogy. For centuries, families throughout the mountain regions of Tennessee, Virginia, Kentucky, and North Carolina have claimed Black Dutch ancestry to explain physical features that did not match their supposed Northern European heritage. Darker skin, black hair, features that suggested Mediterranean or Middle Eastern or Native American or African origins. The term itself is almost certainly a fabrication, a cover story invented to deflect questions about mixed-race ancestry during eras when such ancestry could result in loss of legal rights, social ostracism, or worse. Genealogists have debated the origins of the Black Dutch for generations, proposing theories that range from shipwrecked Spanish sailors to Portuguese Jews fleeing the Inquisition to Native American tribes that intermarried with early settlers. No consensus has ever been reached because the families who claim the identity have been remarkably resistant to investigation, refusing to participate in DNA studies, declining to share family records, treating outside curiosity as an intrusion that must be repelled rather than an opportunity to solve a historical puzzle. Harrison Cole was different, or so I believed. He was a successful businessman in his early 60s, wealthy enough to afford my substantial fees, and apparently motivated by a genuine desire to understand his family's origins. His grandmother had always claimed Black Dutch heritage, he told me, but had refused to elaborate on what that meant or where the family had come from. She had died when Harrison was a teenager, taking her secrets with her, and he had spent decades wondering about the ancestry she had been so determined to hide. He had submitted his DNA to several commercial testing services and received results that only deepened the mystery. A complex mixture of European, Middle Eastern, and trace African ancestry that did not match any standard population profile, combined with unusually high rates of matching with other users who also claimed Black Dutch heritage. He wanted me to investigate, to trace his family tree through records and DNA analysis, to finally understand what Black Dutch really meant. I took the case because it was exactly the kind of challenge I loved. The Black Dutch mystery had fascinated genealogists for years, but few had been given the resources and access necessary to conduct a thorough investigation. Harrison was offering both: a generous budget, access to his extended family for additional DNA samples, and connections to other Black Dutch families who might be willing to participate once they learned that a serious researcher was finally taking their heritage seriously. I saw an opportunity to solve one of the great puzzles of Appalachian history, to publish findings that would establish my reputation beyond the narrow world of professional genealogy. I did not see the trap that was being set for me, the carefully constructed scenario designed to draw me into a world that I was never supposed to discover. The research began normally enough. I analyzed Harrison's DNA results in detail, identifying the specific genetic markers that distinguished his ancestry from standard European profiles. I built a family tree using the records he provided, tracing his maternal line back through generations of mountain families in northeastern Tennessee and southwestern Virginia. I contacted relatives whose DNA had matched his in commercial databases, requesting additional samples and interviews that would help me understand the patterns I was seeing. The work was painstaking but productive, and within a few months I had assembled a preliminary picture of the Cole family history that confirmed some aspects of the Black Dutch legend, while raising new questions about others. The family had indeed been in the mountains since the late 1700s, arriving from somewhere in the mid-Atlantic region and settling in a hollow that straddled the Tennessee-Virginia border. They had intermarried extensively with other families who also claimed Black Dutch heritage, creating a genetic cluster that was distinctively different from the surrounding Scots-Irish and English-descended populations. The DNA analysis suggested multiple ancestral contributions, a strong Mediterranean component, possibly Iberian or Italian, a Middle Eastern component that might indicate Sephardic Jewish ancestry, trace African ancestry that was consistent with the history of mixed-race populations in colonial America, and Native American markers that suggested contact with indigenous peoples at some point in the family's history. The mixture was unusual, but not impossible, consistent with a founding population that had been diverse from the beginning and had maintained that diversity through preferential marriage within the Black Dutch community. But the research also revealed anomalies that I could not explain. The family's paper trail was unusually sparse, even by the standards of Appalachian genealogy, where records were often lost or never created. Birth certificates, death certificates, marriage records, census entries, all of the documentation that normally allows genealogists to trace family histories was either missing or inconsistent for the Cole family and the other Black Dutch families I was investigating. Names changed between documents, birth dates shifted by years or even decades. Individuals appeared in records and then vanished, only to reappear years later in different locations with different identities. The patterns suggested not just poor record-keeping, but deliberate obfuscation, as if the families had been systematically manipulating their paper trails for generations. I mentioned these anomalies to Harrison during one of our regular progress meetings, expecting him to be as puzzled as I was. Instead, his reaction was strange. He became very still, his expression shifting in ways I could not read, and he asked me exactly what I had discovered and who I had shared my findings with. I told him that I had not shared anything yet, that I was still in the research phase, that I wanted to understand the patterns before I drew any conclusions. He nodded slowly, seeming to relax, and suggested that I might benefit from visiting the region where his family had originated, from seeing the landscape and meeting some of the people who still lived there. He offered to arrange introductions, to provide me with accommodations and transportation, to give me whatever I needed to complete my research in the field. I accepted gratefully, not understanding that I was being invited into a trap from which I might never escape. I arrived in the border region of Tennessee and Virginia in October of 2020, during the pandemic, quieted fall, when the mountains were ablaze with color, and the roads were nearly empty of the tourists who normally crowded them. Harrison had arranged for me to stay in a cabin near the community where his family had originated, a hollow accessible only by a single road that wound up through increasingly dense forest before emerging into a small valley surrounded by ridges on all sides. The cabin was comfortable, equipped with modern amenities despite its rustic appearance, and I settled in expecting to spend several weeks conducting interviews and visiting the sites that figured in the Cole family history. The first few days were productive. I met with elderly residents who remembered the old families, recorded their stories about Black Dutch traditions and beliefs, photographed graveyards and homesteads that dated back to the earliest settlement of the region. Everyone I spoke with was friendly and cooperative, willing to share information that I had expected them to guard jealously. They confirmed what my research had suggested, that the Black Dutch families had always been different, had always kept to themselves, had always maintained traditions and practices that set them apart from the surrounding communities. They spoke of the old ways with a mixture of pride and evasiveness, clearly pleased that someone was taking their heritage seriously, but careful not to reveal too much about what that heritage actually entailed. The change came on my fourth night in the hollow, when I received an unexpected visitor at my cabin. A woman appeared at my door just after sunset, introducing herself as Leona Mullins, a cousin of Harrison's who had heard about my research and wanted to offer her assistance. She was perhaps 70 years old, with the dark hair and olive complexion that characterized the Black Dutch, and she carried herself with an authority that suggested she was accustomed to being obeyed. She told me that the family elders had discussed my research and had decided that I should be given access to information that had never been shared with outsiders, records and artifacts that would answer all of my questions about Black Dutch origins. She offered to take me to a location where these materials were kept, warning me only that I must tell no one where I was going, and that I must be prepared to learn things that might challenge everything I thought I knew about genealogy and identity. I should have refused. I should have recognized the warning signs in her evasiveness, in the strangeness of a nighttime visit, in the requirement of secrecy that contradicted every principle of legitimate research. But I was too eager, too convinced that I was on the verge of a breakthrough that would define my career, too arrogant to believe that I could not handle whatever I discovered. I agreed to accompany her, leaving my phone and laptop behind as she requested, climbing into her truck and driving deeper into the mountains, on roads that were not marked on any map I had studied. The drive took more than an hour, winding through terrain so remote that I lost all sense of direction, passing through hollows that seemed uninhabited and climbing ridges that offered no views because the forest was too dense. Eventually, we arrived at a compound that I had not known existed, a cluster of buildings hidden in a narrow valley that could not be seen from any surrounding road or ridge. The buildings were a mixture of old and new, ranging from log cabins that might have been standing for 2 centuries to modern structures with metal roofs and satellite dishes. Lights burned in several windows, and I could see people moving between buildings. More people than I would have expected in such a remote location. Leona led me to one of the newer buildings, a structure that looked like a small office complex, and introduced me to a man she identified as the family's historian, a title that I would later learn had very different implications than I assumed. His name was Ezra Cole, and he was a distant cousin of Harrison's, a man in his 50s with the same dark features and the same unsettling stillness that I had noticed in Leona. He welcomed me warmly, expressed appreciation for my interest in the family's heritage, and offered to show me the archives that the family had maintained for generations. I followed him through corridors that led deeper into the building, descending stairs that took us below ground level, passing through doors that required codes and keys to open. By the time I understood that I was being led into a facility designed to contain people rather than welcome them, it was far too late to escape. The underground facility was larger than anything I could have imagined, a complex of rooms and corridors that had been carved out of the mountain over what must have been decades of work. Ezra explained its purpose with a pride that chilled me more than the temperature of the subterranean air. The Black Dutch, he told me, had never been what outsiders believed. They were not a mystery tribe of uncertain ethnic origin. They were something far more interesting, a society of specialists who had been perfecting the art of identity for more than 200 years. The ambiguous ancestry, the resistance to investigation, the manipulation of records, all of it was deliberate, a demonstration of capabilities that the families had been selling to clients since the early days of the American Republic. The operation had begun simply, Ezra explained, with families who had reason to hide their origins helping others who needed the same service. Escaped slaves, indentured servants fleeing their contracts, criminals evading justice, debtors escaping creditors, all of them had found their way to the Black Dutch communities, where they were given new names, new histories, New documents that allowed them to start fresh in a world that offered few second chances. The service had been informal at first, a matter of mutual aid among people who understood what it meant to need a new identity. But over the generations, it had evolved into something more organized, more sophisticated, more profitable. By the 20th century, the Black Dutch had developed capabilities that rivaled any government. They could create complete identity packages, birth certificates, social security numbers, educational credentials, employment histories, credit records, everything necessary for a person to exist in modern America without any connection to who they had been before. They maintained networks of collaborators in vital records offices, in hospitals, in schools, in government agencies, people who were paid to insert false records and to overlook inconsistencies when questions arose. They operated safe houses throughout the country, where clients could stay while their new identities were being constructed, where they could learn the details of their fabricated histories, where they could practice being the people they were about to become. The clients came from everywhere and for every reason. Domestic violence survivors who needed to escape abusive partners, witnesses in criminal cases who feared retaliation, white-collar criminals who had stolen enough to afford a complete disappearance, ordinary people who had simply made mistakes they could not live with and wanted to start over. The Black Dutch served them all, charging fees that ranged from tens of thousands to millions, depending on the complexity of the case and the urgency of the client's need. The operation generated enormous revenue that was laundered through legitimate businesses throughout the region and invested in the infrastructure necessary to maintain and expand the operation. But not all of the clients were voluntary. That was the part of Ezra's explanation that transformed my understanding of what I had discovered from fascinating to horrifying. Some people were brought to the Black Dutch, not because they wanted new identities, but because someone else wanted them to disappear. Inconvenient relatives, troublesome business partners, witnesses who might testify against powerful interests, all of them could be made to vanish, their identities erased so completely that it was as if they had never existed. Some of these unwilling clients were released after their identities had been stripped away, turned loose in distant cities with no money, no documentation, no way to prove who they really were. Others were not released at all. The mountains were full of places where bodies could be hidden forever, and the Black Dutch had been using those places for as long as they had been providing identity services. I was being told all of this, I realized, because I was not expected to leave. My research had come too close to exposing connections that the families had spent centuries concealing. The DNA analysis I had conducted could potentially link the Black Dutch to clients they had served, to identities they had created, to crimes they had committed and facilitated. Harrison Cole had hired me not because he wanted to understand his heritage, but because the families wanted to understand how much damage a determined genealogist could do with modern genetic technology. My findings had apparently alarmed them enough that they had decided I needed to be neutralized, either by being brought into the operation or by being eliminated entirely. Ezra offered me a choice that was not really a choice. I could join the organization, using my skills to help them adapt to the challenges that genetic genealogy posed to their business model. My expertise in DNA analysis could help them understand how to create identities that would withstand modern investigative techniques, how to defeat the databases that were making it increasingly difficult for people to disappear completely. I would be well compensated, treated as a valued colleague, given a comfortable life in exchange for my cooperation. Or I could refuse, in which case I would become one of the unwilling clients whose identity would be erased so thoroughly that no one would ever know what had happened to me. I chose cooperation, not because I believed I could actually help them, but because I needed time. Time to understand the full scope of the operation, time to identify weaknesses that might allow me to escape, time to find some way to alert the outside world to what I had discovered. I was given quarters in the underground facility and assigned to work with a team that was developing strategies for defeating genetic genealogy. I learned the technical details of how identities were created, the networks of collaborators who made the operation possible, the financial flows that sustained it. I learned about specific cases, specific clients, specific people who had disappeared voluntarily or involuntarily through the Black Dutch network. I learned more than I ever wanted to know about how completely a person could be erased from existence. The weeks I spent in that facility were the most terrifying of my life, but they were also educational in ways that I could never have anticipated. I learned that the Black Dutch operation was not a single organization, but a confederation of families who had been cooperating for generations, bound together by blood and by the secrets they shared. I learned that the leadership was hereditary, passed down through specific bloodlines that traced their authority back to the founders of the operation in the late 1700s. I learned that the families maintained a mythology about their origins that cast their work as a sacred calling, a duty to provide sanctuary to the persecuted and the desperate, a continuation of traditions that predated their arrival in America. The mythology was self-serving and selective, ignoring the crimes and the coercion that had always been part of the operation, but it was sincerely believed by many of the people involved. I also learned that the operation was facing challenges it had never confronted before. Genetic genealogy was only one of the threats. Digital surveillance, biometric identification, the proliferation of cameras and databases that tracked people's movements and transactions. All of these developments were making it harder to create and maintain false identities. The Black Dutch were adapting, developing new techniques and new technologies, but some members of the leadership believed that the operation was approaching the end of its viability, that within a generation or two, it would no longer be possible to make people disappear completely. There were debates about what to do when that day came, whether to wind down the operation gradually or to continue as long as possible and accept the eventual consequences. These debates created tensions within the organization that I hoped I might be able to exploit. My escape came in late November, after approximately 6 weeks of captivity. I had been working to gain the trust of my captors, demonstrating my value through genuine contributions to their technical challenges, gradually earning privileges that gave me more freedom of movement within the facility. I had identified a potential route to the surface, a maintenance corridor that connected the main complex to an outbuilding that was less heavily guarded than the primary entrances. I had memorized the codes necessary to pass through the security doors. I had studied the patterns of guards and workers, identifying windows of time when the corridor would be unobserved. I had prepared myself mentally for the physical challenges of escaping through terrain I did not know in weather that was turning increasingly harsh. The opportunity came during a period of disruption caused by a family emergency involving one of the senior members of the organization. Attention and resources were focused elsewhere, and for a brief window, the security protocols that had kept me contained were less rigorously enforced. I made my move in the early hours of the morning, slipping through the maintenance corridor, emerging into the cold mountain air, and running into the darkness with no clear idea of where I was going, but absolute certainty that I had to get as far from the compound as possible before my absence was discovered. I walked for 3 days through terrain that seemed designed to kill anyone who entered it unprepared. The mountains were steep and densely forested. The valleys were choked with underbrush. The streams were swollen with recent rain and running too fast to cross safely. I had no food, no navigation equipment, no way to call for help. I survived on determination and the knowledge that the people searching for me knew these mountains far better than I did and would catch me if I stopped moving. By the time I stumbled onto a road and flagged down a passing truck, I was hypothermic, dehydrated, and barely coherent. The driver took me to a hospital in Johnson City, where I spent 2 weeks recovering from exposure and the accumulated effects of my captivity. I told the authorities everything I knew. I described the compound, the underground facility, the identity operation, the people I had met, and the things I had witnessed. I provided names, locations, technical details that I thought would be sufficient to trigger a massive investigation into what I had discovered. The FBI agents who interviewed me seemed to take my account seriously at first, asking detailed follow-up questions and promising to investigate my claims. But as the days passed, their attitude changed. They had visited the location I described and found nothing. The compound I remembered was empty, showing no signs of the operations I had described. The people I had named could not be located or had alibis that placed them elsewhere during the period of my alleged captivity. Harrison Cole, the client who had hired me, had apparently died in a car accident 2 weeks before my escape, eliminating the person who could have corroborated my initial involvement with the case. The official conclusion was that I had experienced some kind of breakdown, that the stress of pandemic isolation, combined with my obsessive immersion in genealogical research, had produced the elaborate delusion that I had come to believe was real. The FBI closed their investigation. The local police in Tennessee declined to pursue the case. My professional colleagues, when I tried to share what I had learned, responded with concern for my mental health rather than interest in my discoveries. Within months of my escape, I had been transformed from a respected expert in my field into a cautionary tale about the psychological dangers of genealogical obsession. I have spent the years since my escape trying to find someone who would believe me, trying to gather evidence that would prove what I experienced was real, trying to expose the Black Dutch operation before it could adapt to the attention I had drawn and become even harder to detect. I have failed at all of these objectives. The families have had centuries to perfect their ability to disappear, and they have applied those skills to concealing their own existence as effectively as they conceal the identities they create for clients. Every lead I follow goes cold. Every contact I develop stops responding. Every piece of evidence I assemble turns out to be insufficient to convince anyone who does not already want to believe. But I know what I saw. I know what I learned during those weeks in the underground facility. I know that somewhere in the mountains of Appalachia, there is an organization that has been making people disappear for more than 200 years, an organization that has adapted to every challenge and survived every threat, an organization that will continue operating until someone with more resources and more credibility than I possess finally exposes it to the light. The Black Dutch are real. The Mystery Tribe is not a mystery at all, but a cover story for capabilities that most people cannot imagine. The cabins scattered through those hollows are not the homes of simple mountain families, but nodes in a network that extends throughout the country, a network that can make anyone disappear if the price is right. I'm writing this account because I have no other options left. I am writing it, knowing that the people I am describing will read it and will take whatever steps they consider necessary to protect themselves. I am writing it hoping that someone, somewhere, will recognize the truth in what I have described and will find a way to do what I could not. The DNA does not lie, that is still true. But the people who have been hiding in plain sight for 2 centuries have learned to make the DNA say what they want it to say, to create histories that never happened, to erase existences that were all too real. They are masters of a craft that most people do not know exists, and they have been practicing that craft longer than the United States has been a nation. If you are reading this, and you have the ability to investigate, here is what I ask of you. Do not approach the region directly. The families have informants throughout the local population, people who will report any outsider asking questions about Black Dutch heritage or identity services. Instead, look for the clients. Look for the people who have used the network's services and who might be willing to talk in exchange for protection. Look for the financial flows that sustain the operation, the money laundering channels that convert cash payments into legitimate wealth. Look for the collaborators in government agencies who make the operation possible, the people who insert false records and overlook inconsistencies when questions arise. The network has survived for more than 200 years because it has always been one step ahead of anyone trying to expose it. It survived the transition from paper records to electronic databases. It survived the development of modern forensic techniques. It is working right now to survive the challenge posed by genetic genealogy. It will continue to survive unless someone with sufficient resources and determination finally catches up with it. I do not know if I will live to see that day. I do not know if the families have already decided that I have become a sufficient threat, that I need to be eliminated. I do not know if this account will be dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed woman, or if it will reach someone who recognizes the truth and acts on it. But I know what I experienced. I know what I learned. I know that the Black Dutch are still operating, still making people disappear, still creating identities that allow criminals to escape justice, and victims to escape their abusers, and inconvenient people to simply cease to exist. My name is Dr. Meredith Vance. I spent 6 weeks as a captive of the Black Dutch Identity Network in the Appalachian Mountains. I escaped, but I could not expose them. I have told you everything I know. The rest is up to you. The mystery tribe is not a mystery. It is a business, it is a crime, it is a tradition that has been perfected over 2 centuries of practice. And somewhere in those mountains, right now, someone is disappearing. Someone is becoming someone else. Someone is being erased. The Black Dutch are waiting. They have been waiting for a long time. And they will keep waiting, keep working, keep making people vanish until someone finally stops them. Please let that someone be you. Please. Before I finish this account, I need to share specific details that might help an investigator succeed where I failed. During my time in the facility, I learned information about the network's structure and operations that I have not shared with anyone because I feared it would endanger me further. But I have decided that the risk of silence is greater than the risk of disclosure, and that whoever pursues this truth will need every advantage I can provide. The network is organized into 7 family groups, each controlling a specific geographic region and maintaining relationships with collaborators in specific institutions. The Cole family, which includes Harrison and Ezra, controls the Central Appalachian region and maintains connections with vital records offices in Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky. Other families control regions extending from the mid-Atlantic states to the Deep South, from the Ohio Valley to the Texas borderlands. Each family operates semi-independently, but coordinates with the others through periodic meetings and shared databases that track clients, identities, and potential threats. The financial infrastructure is centered on a network of businesses that appear legitimate but exist primarily to launder the proceeds of identity services. Real estate companies, construction firms, agricultural operations, and small manufacturing businesses throughout the region are owned directly or indirectly by the families and serve as channels for converting cash payments into legitimate wealth. The total annual revenue of the operation, based on conversations I overheard during my captivity, exceeds $50 million, with individual identity packages commanding prices ranging from $20,000 for basic services to several million for complete disappearances that include ongoing support and protection. The collaborator network extends into every level of government. Clerks in vital records offices throughout the country have been recruited to insert false birth certificates, death certificates, and marriage records into official databases. Hospital administrators have been compromised to create medical records for people who never existed and to destroy records for people who need to disappear. Bank employees have been paid to open accounts under false identities and to overlook the suspicious transactions that accompany identity changes. The network has even penetrated law enforcement, with contacts in police departments and federal agencies who provide warnings when investigations get too close to the operation. The physical infrastructure includes the compound where I was held, which I believe is located somewhere in the mountains near the junction of Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky, but which I cannot pinpoint more precisely because I was disoriented during both my arrival and my escape. The compound includes the underground facility where identity documents are created and where unwilling clients are held, as well as surface buildings that house the administrative operations and provide living quarters for family members involved in the business. Similar compounds exist in other regions, operated by the other family groups, creating a distributed network that cannot be shut down by targeting any single location. The technical capabilities of the operation are more sophisticated than I initially understood. The families have invested heavily in the technology necessary to defeat modern identity verification systems, including equipment for creating biometric credentials, software for manipulating digital records, and expertise in the systems used by government agencies and financial institutions to verify identities. They employ specialists in computer security, document forgery, and database manipulation, some of whom were recruited from legitimate careers in these fields, and others who were trained within the network from childhood. If these details help anyone pursue the truth about the Black Dutch, my captivity will have served some purpose. If they do not, If this account is dismissed like everything else I have tried, then at least I will know that I did everything within my power to expose what I discovered. My name is Dr. Meredith Vance. The Black Dutch are real. The identity network is real. The disappearances are real. And if I vanish after publishing this account, you will know that they found me before I could find them. Please do not let my story end that way. Please do something. Please. There are additional aspects of my experience that I have been reluctant to share because they involve people who may still be alive and who might face retaliation if their connection to my account were known. But I have decided that completeness is more important than caution at this point, and that anyone who investigates the Black Dutch will need to understand the full scope of what they are dealing with. During my captivity, I met several other people who were being held in the facility, some voluntarily and some not. The voluntary clients were people who had come to the network seeking new identities, people who were waiting while their documentation was prepared, and their old identities were being erased from databases throughout the country. They ranged from a woman fleeing an abusive husband to a businessman who had embezzled millions from his company and needed to disappear before the auditors discovered the shortfall. They spoke about the network with a mixture of gratitude and fear, grateful for the second chance they were being given, but afraid of what would happen if they ever violated the terms of their agreements or revealed what they knew about the operation. The involuntary clients were different. They were people who had been brought to the network against their will, people whose identities were being erased, not to give them new lives, but to eliminate them as threats to someone else's interests. I met a woman who had been a bookkeeper for a company that turned out to be involved in fraud, who had been brought to the network because she knew too much about financial transactions that powerful people wanted kept secret. I met a man who had been a witness in a criminal case, who had been taken before he could testify, and whose disappearance had caused the case to collapse. I met people whose only crime was knowing the wrong thing about the wrong person, and who had been delivered to the Black Dutch to ensure their permanent silence. Some of these involuntary clients would eventually be released, I learned, turned loose in distant cities with no documentation and no way to prove who they really were. The network had techniques for this that had been refined over generations. Strip away every document that connected a person to their identity, destroy their credit history, their employment records, their social security number, manipulate databases to make it appear that they had never existed, then release them into a world where identity is everything, where you cannot rent an apartment or open a bank account or get a job without documentation, where being undocumented means being invisible, powerless, utterly dependent on whoever might choose to help you. The people released this way rarely caused problems for the network. They were too busy trying to survive to pursue justice against the people who had destroyed their lives. Others were not released at all. The mountains had been swallowing secrets for centuries, and some secrets needed to stay buried forever. I did not witness any killings during my captivity, but I saw evidence that they occurred. I saw rooms that appeared to be designed for purposes that went beyond simple detention. I heard conversations that referred to final solutions for clients who could not be released and whose continued existence posed unacceptable risks. I understood that the network's services included not just the creation of new identities, but the permanent elimination of old ones, through methods that left no trace and answered no questions. I want to describe the compound itself in more detail, because any investigation will need to locate it and similar facilities in other regions. The surface buildings were arranged in a rough circle around a central courtyard, creating a contained space that could be monitored from multiple angles. The buildings included residential structures for family members, administrative offices where the business operations were managed, workshops where documents were created and equipment was maintained, and storage facilities for the materials needed to support identity creation. The buildings were connected by covered walkways that allowed movement between them without exposure to aerial surveillance, and the entire compound was surrounded by forest that had been deliberately maintained to provide concealment from any vantage point outside the valley. The underground facility was accessed through several entrances, some in the surface buildings and others concealed in the surrounding terrain. The facility extended deep into the mountain, with corridors that branched in multiple directions and rooms that served various functions. There was a document production center, equipped with printing equipment, laminating machines, and computers loaded with templates for identity documents from every state and several foreign countries. There was a database center where the network's records were maintained and where connections to external systems allowed manipulation of government and commercial databases. There was a medical facility where clients could receive treatment without creating records that might later prove problematic. There were detention areas where involuntary clients were held, some in reasonable comfort and others in conditions that were designed to break resistance. And there were areas that I was never permitted to enter, areas that I believe were used for purposes that even my captors considered too sensitive to share with a potential recruit. The security systems protecting the compound were sophisticated beyond anything I would have expected from a rural criminal operation. Motion sensors covered the surrounding terrain, detecting any approach that was not via the authorized routes. Cameras monitored every entrance and every significant space within the compound. Communications were encrypted, using methods that the network's technical specialists claimed were unbreakable by any government agency. The entire facility had backup power systems that could maintain operations indefinitely in the event of grid failure. And the personnel were trained to implement protocols that would destroy evidence and evacuate key assets if any threat materialized that could not be otherwise neutralized. I learned during my captivity that the network had faced investigations before, including at least 2 federal investigations that had threatened to expose the operation. In both cases, the investigations had been neutralized through a combination of the network's contacts within law enforcement and the deliberate elimination of evidence and witnesses. The families took these threats seriously and had developed playbooks for responding to various scenarios, from routine inquiries by local police to full-scale federal investigations. The playbooks included protocols for destroying records, relocating assets, eliminating potential witnesses, and creating diversions that would draw attention away from the true scope of the operation. My escape had apparently triggered one of these playbooks, which explained why the authorities who investigated my claims found nothing when they visited the compound. The network's history, as I learned it from Ezra and others, was even more extensive than the 2 centuries I initially understood. The families claimed descent from groups that had been providing identity services since the colonial era, when religious dissenters, escaped criminals, and people fleeing debt or scandal had all found refuge in the Appalachian backcountry. The formal organization of the network had begun in the late 1700s, but the skills and relationships that made it possible had been developing for generations before that. The Black Dutch identity had been created during this period as a cover story that would explain the diverse origins of the founding families and justify their resistance to outside inquiry. It had served that purpose effectively for more than 2 centuries, deflecting curiosity and protecting the operation from exposure. The families believed that their work served a necessary function in society, providing escape routes for people who had no other options and balancing the scales of justice in ways that official institutions could not. They acknowledged that some of their clients were criminals, but argued that their services also helped innocent people escape unjust situations. They pointed to domestic violence survivors who had found safety through new identities, to political refugees who had escaped persecution, to whistleblowers who had been protected from retaliation. The moral calculus they employed was complex and self-serving, but it was not entirely without merit. The network did help some people who genuinely deserved help, even as it also served clients whose motives were far from sympathetic. This complexity is part of what makes the Black Dutch so difficult to confront. They are not a simple criminal organization that can be dismantled by arresting the leadership and seizing the assets. They are a culture, a tradition, a way of life that has been passed down through generations and that is deeply embedded in the communities where they operate. The families genuinely believe in what they do, and they have created structures that can survive the loss of any individual or even any entire family group. Stopping the Black Dutch will require not just law enforcement action, but a fundamental disruption of the social and economic systems that sustain them. I do not know if such disruption is possible. I do not know if anyone has the resources and the will to pursue the Black Dutch to the degree necessary to actually end their operations. But I believe that the attempt must be made, that allowing the network to continue operating indefinitely is not acceptable, that the people who have been harmed and the people who will be harmed in the future deserve better than the silence that has protected the Black Dutch for more than 2 centuries. This is my final plea to whoever reads this account. Do not dismiss what I have written as the delusion of a disturbed mind. Do not accept the official narrative that nothing I described is real. Look at the evidence. Follow the patterns. Find the truth that I was unable to prove on my own. The Black Dutch are real. The identity network is real. The disappearances are real. And somewhere in those mountains, the operation continues, waiting for the next client who needs to become someone else, waiting for the next person who needs to vanish, waiting for the next threat that needs to be eliminated. My name is Dr. Meredith Vance. I have told you everything I know. I have given you every tool I can provide. The rest is beyond my ability to influence. May you succeed where I failed. May justice finally come to those who have been hiding in plain sight for more than 200 years. May the mystery tribe finally be exposed for what it truly is. And may God protect anyone who attempts to pursue this truth, because the Black Dutch have been protecting themselves for a very long time, and they will not surrender their secrets without a fight. The buried truth is waiting to be uncovered. Please be the one who finally uncovers it. Please.